Hey guys, welcome to Infinite Insight Geometry, Lesson 1.4, Converse, Inverse, and Contrapositive. Let's begin. So, we return to 1.3 with conditional statements. They are logical statements consisting of a hypothesis and a conclusion. For example, if a shape has a triangle, then it has three sides. But if we rearrange and modify this conditional statement, will it still be true? What if we switch the hypothesis and conclusion? What if we negate them? Maybe we can say if a shape is not a triangle, then it does not have three sides. How many ways can we rearrange them? Turns out there are four. There's the original conditional, there's the converse, there's the inverse, and there's the contrapositive. Now, note for futures, the next few slides, the hypothesis we'll denote as P, the conclusion is Q, and any tildes are going to be not. So if you see that little wavy symbol, that means not. So not the hypothesis, not the conclusion. I'll show you what that means when we get there. But first I just want to start out with the original conditional. If the hypothesis, then the conclusion. If P, then Q. This is the original conditional statement. This is it, unmodified, unrearranged. We didn't do anything to it. This is it in its purest form. But that's a little boring, so we go to the second way to modify a conditional statement, which is the converse. If Q, then P. If you have the conclusion, then the hypothesis. The converse of conditional statement switches the hypothesis and conclusion. Next we have the inverse. If not the hypothesis, then not the conclusion. The inverse negates both the hypothesis and the conclusion, meaning that it has a different meaning than before. And then you also have the contrapositive. If Q, then P. The contrapositive of a conditional statement negates both the hypothesis and the conclusion and switches them. So it's like a converse and then an inverse, or an inverse and then a converse. So, let's take an example. If an animal is a dog, then it is a mammal. So what would be the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive? Well, the converse, if you look back, is the conclusion, then the hypothesis. So the converse would be, if an animal is a mammal, then it is a dog. So what would the inverse be? Well, you would just negate both the hypothesis and conclusion. Now, negating means adding not to the start of the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if an animal is not a dog, if it is not a mammal, so the inverse would be, if an animal is not a dog, then it is not a mammal. Okay? And then you have the contrapositive. And the contrapositive is a mix of the converse and the inverse. So we take the converse and we take the inverse of that. If an animal is not a mammal, then it is not a dog. If it is not a mammal, then it is not a dog. Now, you also have to think, are these true or false? Because what we really want to learn here is the truth values. Truth values tell you the truth of the statement. Is it true or is it false? The conditional and the contrapositive will always have the same truth value. So going back over here, if an animal is a dog, then it is a mammal. All dogs are mammals, so this must be true, meaning that the contrapositive must also be true. If an animal is not a mammal, then it is not a dog, because any other animal that you think about that is not a mammal should also be not a dog, because all dogs fit into the category of mammals. And then the converse and the inverse also had the same truth value. So if you also see back here, if an animal is a mammal, then it is a dog. That's not true, because not all mammals are dogs. There are also cats. There are also horses, and there are also lions. There are a lot of other mammals that you can think about. So not all mammals are dogs, meaning that the converse is not true. But that also means that the inverse is not true, because they must have the same truth value. And you can see that the inverse is also false. If an animal is not a dog, then it is not a mammal. Because just because it is not a dog doesn't mean that it is a mammal. Because you can have a cat that is not a dog, but it is still a mammal. Seeing how the converse, inverse, and contrapositive relate to the actual conditional statement helps us realize how important these conditional statements are moving forward to these next few topics that we're going to be learning about. This is like the foundation of geometry. We're building it from the ground up. So that will be the end of today's lesson. If you liked the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And if you have any questions, I have my Gmail down below. Please feel free to email me about any questions, and I will see you in the next video.